Hi, I'm Lindsay Reiser, and we have breaking news from Washington and the Middle East. President Trump announced a short time ago that not only has he canceled planned strikes against Iran later this evening, but that an agreement between the two countries could be signed imminently. CBS News chief foreign affairs correspondent and Face the Nation moderator Margaret Brennan joins us now with exclusive information on the so-called Memorandum of Understanding. So, Margaret, what do we know? Is the MOU a deal or a framework to talk about a deal?
It is a framework to talk about a deal. You can think about this like a letter of intent. It is an understanding of the framework for future negotiations. But in the meantime, for about 60 days worth of talks, but in the meantime, it will help open up freedom of trade. That is the intent of this. We expect, according to multiple diplomatic sources, I have been working the phones and speaking to them about what is going into this draft. I am told that you could see a signing of this Memorandum of Understanding early next week. We know early next week also happens to be when President Trump is going to the G7, the gathering of the largest economies, and that there had been a big focus planned on that Strait of Hormuz. Remember, some of the Western allies of the United States and others had promised that if the conflict were to end, they would help to clear that strait to restore global trade. I'm told that process of demining and clearing the strait would take at least 30 days. And then what we know from this Memorandum of Understanding framework is that it would kick off a 60-day time period for talks about bigger issues like the nuclear program Iran has and some of the details of it. I do have, Lindsay, some detail there on the broad strokes that are being agreed in principle. One of them is that Iran will commit to a lockout of about 15 to 20 years during which they would stop enriching uranium. They would dismantle their nuclear sites. There are 3 known. Remember, last June, the United States helped to bomb 3 of them. There was also a new nuclear site they would agree to deal with. I am told that UN inspectors from the IAEA would be directly involved in inspections as well as the process of getting rid of the enriched material that already exists in Iran but is buried under the rubble of those 3 sites that the U.S. and Israel bombed last June. There's broad language there referring to the conflict in Lebanon. That matters because Iran's proxy forces, the militias it supports around the Middle East, have been an ongoing concern. There's some reference there, but I don't have a lot of detail on that front of the conflict. And we do know that there is a pledge there to lift sanctions over time and also to provide access to currently frozen Iranian assets that are locked up in bank accounts around the world. But there would be conditions placed on those accounts before funds are used for purchase of humanitarian goods or rebuilding.
Now, Margaret, we have heard the president and the vice president and the secretary of defense accuse Iranian leadership of stringing the president along, tapping, not being serious about a deal. I know you're asking your sources this question. What is it that took Iranian leadership to come to the table to agree to this MOU?
So part of the complication here is that the United States and Israel have killed over time many of the leaders of Iran's councils there, the national security councils that make some of these decisions. But I am told that as of last night, which is when there were talks being held in Tehran with technical advisors from some of the mediating countries, that there was a nod to an agreement. We took some time today as we listened for the Iranians and the U.S. officials to weigh the drafts that were brought back and shared with their capitals, and that there was, on the U.S. side, an agreement. Now, pen to paper is another matter. We haven't seen the supreme leader come out with any kind of public statement. We haven't seen an official announcement from the Iranian government, so that is an important caveat you point to there. They have some disarray between the military and intelligence establishment, the Revolutionary Guard, and then some of the diplomats who have been for some time willing to engage and to negotiate on the nuclear program. So getting their own government aligned is part of the complication here. And we know that in the past few weeks, there have been multiple drafts of this Memorandum of Understanding that have gone back and forth. And so there's always the risk that until every little last bit is done and signed, that this could fall apart.
You mentioned 30 days to clear the strait. You obviously have been covering this ever since the start of the war, February 28th. What have experts been telling you about what this means for the global oil trade and how quickly prices could start coming down?
So one of the things that the president and U.S. negotiators have been keenly aware of is the fact that the globe has been relying on these inventories, these stockpiles, these commercial inventories of fuel, to lean into those to offset the shortage in some parts of the world or offset the inability to move fuel freely around the world because of the Strait of Hormuz and the obstruction there. Because of that drawdown in inventories, we will see, it is expected, a further spike in prices by mid-July. That is what oil executives have been warning, oil and energy analysts have been warning the White House about, that there could be a secondary price shock about to hit in mid-July, because we have, over the next 5 weeks, some real concern there. It is very much tied to the pressure the president feels to make a deal. We know that for the president, he loves brokering deals. We know for the Iranians, they are more than willing to continue to talk, but it's whether they act. And what I'm told the teeth in this broad strokes agreement would be is the sequencing of releasing funds and the sequencing of accessing those frozen assets. So there are incentives there for Iran to follow through in phase 2, which would come after they clear the Strait of Hormuz and after they promise not to have their proxy forces fire on vessels in the Strait. But that phase 2, this is where it could really get messy. I spent a lot of time following the nuclear talks during the Obama administration. It was 2 years of negotiations from the time they had a memorandum of understanding to when they had an international accord. The Trump administration wants to get this done in a matter of weeks.
Margaret, you frequently interview members on both sides of the aisle, and obviously history will be the judge on whether this operation was successful. But has it already damaged the president politically to a certain extent?
Well, if we saw that secondary energy price shock politically, it could damage the president's party in terms of this midterm election cycle that we're in the middle of. We're about, 5 months out from it. So for anyone who's trying to buy a plane ticket or fueling up the car during these summer months, they were going to feel it even more acutely and might not feel that positive about showing up to vote in the fall. That's a political concern for the president. What we also know is that in Congress, some of the Iran hawks have been very concerned that the president has been too eager to get a deal. So some of the people in his own party are out there going, wait a second, we need to see the text of whatever's agreed to here. And this wouldn't be a new argument. In fact, during the Obama administration, many of the very same Iran hawks said, wait a second, the president of the United States can't put together a deal like this without consulting with lawmakers first. And it is very interesting that just in the last few minutes, Senator Lindsey Graham, huge Iran hawk, huge supporter of Israel, oftentimes on that golf course beside the president is saying, wait a second, I want to see this deal come before Congress for review. There has been a deep concern that the president has been too eager for political reasons, or at least just to get this done, to take a deal. And for some, they see this as a goal, a war where the prime goals have yet to be achieved, and a war which would be ended by negotiating with the very same regime that just months ago the president was saying needed to be removed from power. It is the same regime that you hear them refer to for the past 47 years has been at war with the United States. So by cutting a deal with that regime, it is guaranteeing that regime remains in power, at least for the foreseeable future in some way, because the United States would be freeing up funds to them, would be releasing pressure on them by lifting those sanctions. So this is not without controversy politically for the president. So either way, he is in a tough spot. And then the other factor we haven't talked about, the Israeli prime minister. It was Israel and the United States locked arm in arm that launched this campaign in February. And by the way, last June launched the bombing campaign on the 3 nuclear sites. It is not clear that the U.S. and Israel are aligned on the end state to this conflict. And they have their own politics at home as well. So that's a long way of saying it's not done till it's done.
Margaret, Brennan, thank you so much. Let's go to CBS News Middle East contributor Courtney Kealy. Courtney, what would you like to pick up on?
Well, Margaret made some really important points. The one thing that she said was that President Trump doesn't necessarily control what Prime Minister Netanyahu will do in Lebanon, in southern Lebanon. And we've seen those issues recently in terms of the Iranian regime, which is now more militaristic or coalesced around the military and less around the religious clerics than it's been in the last 47 years in recent months since this war. The military, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, wants to see a ceasefire between Hezbollah and the Israelis. And that's been going back and forth. And then we saw the Prime Minister Netanyahu hit Dahia outside the southern suburbs, but within the outskirts of Beirut, and the Iranians balked at that. So these drafts of the memo of understanding were released to both sides. They agreed to take it from the Pakistanis on Memorial Day weekend. But then they stopped. And as Margaret said, one of the reasons while President Trump was trying to decide, and Secretary of State Marco Rubio was saying he's looking at this, the Republican, his base balked at what he was going to agree on. The biggest issue, before we even get to nuclear, is this unfreezing of funds, because it's a lot of money. It's about $24 billion, and they would release half, about $12 billion, to get, to keep going down the road. It would a memo of understanding to continue to talk for 30 days to 60 days, and then to start even talking about the really hard things like the nuclear issues, the nuclear plant issues. Margaret mentioned last year when they hit Natanz, for instance, where the highly enriched uranium is. Some people believe it's under Natanz. Some people believe that Pickaxe Mountain, as it's called, is another nuclear site that the Iranians have been working on since that 12-day war and the U.S. bombing last June. So a lot to work out. The IAEA has not had eyes on this. It really is now not just the old regime, not the grandfathers of the Islamic revolution, but the sons and the grandsons. So you have Mojtaba Khamenei. He hasn't appeared in public. We haven't heard his voice. We haven't seen his face. But apparently he is among the leadership. He served in the Iran-Iraq War at 17 years old. The Hamid Battalion that he served in, they're all heads and top leadership right now that have coalesced around each other in the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps and kind of seized the power from some of these families like Ali Larijani. Ali Larijani was killed since the war began. Some people were also killed, some of these elected leadership. So while the Iranian people were hoping for regime change, what it looked like is it changed or morphed into a more militaristic, a more Iranian Revolutionary Guard power base that goes all the way back to them serving together in their teens and 20s and 30s that are now sitting as a consortium deciding whether they will go forward with any kind of deal that the U.S. is talking about or they're talking about. But they give so many hard lines, and it's hard to get past anything. Ceasefire in southern Lebanon, no bombing in Beirut. What will they do with the highly enriched uranium? How long will they even start talking about whether Iran can have a peaceful nuclear program, whether it can enrich anything, whether it will take the HEU, the highly enriched uranium, out of the country and bring it to a third country? These are all things we've been circulating. I've been telling you over and over again. We keep hearing it, but what they're at now is the idea we can start talking. We have a memo of understanding. It's literally what it sounds like. We can start with this, we can start talking, and we can start taking things off the box. But there are many different equations. One of them, southern Lebanon, which has now become a thing, a huge issue with Israel. Prime Minister Netanyahu is going into elections. That's regional, but that's now also global.
Okay, Courtney Kealy, thank you so much for your analysis.